Donald Trump's negotiators are taking another run at trying to get a truce in the Russian-Ukraine war, even as economic pressure builds on Russia as sanctions and other pressure increases. Meanwhile, a study gives new insight into the staggering casualties on both sides of that conflict that is now approaching its fourth anniversary. What are the chances of a deal now that could find a truce, if not a permanent end to the conflict?
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome to Potomac Watch. That's what we'll talk about today, the daily podcast of Wall Street Journal Opinion. I'm Paul Gigot, here with Kate Batchelder Odell, and here in studio, Jillian Melcher, usually ensconced in London and a frequent traveler to Ukraine since the war began in 2020. Good to see you in person, Jillian. So I'll just start by telling you what I heard from a U.S. official who's deeply involved in the talks with both sides. And the person was actually optimistic, believe it or not, about kind of getting some kind of settlement. Said the main one breakthrough is that they forced both sides to talk about security guarantees and put them down in tangible ways on paper so they could start to trade. And that Zelensky, Vladimir Zelensky, the Ukrainian president, is very happy with the security guarantees. Now, we don't know the details of them, which is a problem, and my source wouldn't say, because doesn't want to get it out there in a way that might spoil it, but was reasonably optimistic that, at least from the Ukrainian side, they were happy with them. Second, there's something called the Prosperity Agreement with Russia, which outlines bringing Russia back into the world of commerce. And especially with the U.S., kind of co-investment, that kind of thing, that is supposed to be a carrot for Vladimir Putin and Russia to get back in the game of a normal nation as opposed to a marauding power. And my source conceded that the big outstanding issue is land. How much will Ukraine have to give up in the east, in Donbass? And how much will Russia settle for? And will Russia have to give up any land? And that nobody concedes. Neither side has put their final offer on the table, but there was some optimism about getting there, making progress. Jillian, what do you think of that outline?
So I'm interested in it for a couple of reasons. I mean, I think right now what's under discussion are Article 5-like security guarantees. That's what we keep hearing.
Explain what Article 5 is.
It's an attack on one is an attack on all.
And it's part of NATO.
And it's part of NATO. So Ukraine is not on an imminent path to join NATO. The question is what these Article 5-like guarantees entail, and if Ukraine is going to have to give territorial concessions in exchange for that. Russia wants, at minimum, the whole of the Donbass region, but that's a really important region because it's home to the fortress belt. That's the Ukrainian defensive fortified position that has stopped the Russians from rolling further into the country. So when I'm talking to troops on the ground, what they say is these security guarantees need to be at least the equivalent of this fortress belt. We count on force to stop the Russians. So I was looking at polling on this. Zelensky said that an offer like this he'd have to put before the Ukrainian public. There's still some skepticism. Kiev International Institute of Sociology, one of the most respected bodies out there, talking about how 52% would categorically reject the transfer of Donbass region for security guarantees, while only about 40% are ready to accept. So the devil here is really in the details, especially given how Russia tends to make promises and then promptly violate them.
Yeah, and last day or so, Kate, I saw that the Russian foreign minister said, we reject this security guarantee offer. So it doesn't appear that Russia wants to make those, accepts that deal so far. And they keep returning every single time. You broach this in public, at least, our original war aims are still intact. And those war aims were basically the surrender of Ukraine to Russian suzerainty, if I may use a old-fashioned word.
Well, you had the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, saying this week that sometimes you go a long time and you negotiate and there's not a breakthrough and then suddenly there is. That is true. And so I would like to remain optimistic that a deal here would be achievable. I think the axis that it's currently rotating on is that the more land Ukraine has to give up, the really tougher those security guarantees have to be. Because Jillian was describing, if Ukraine were to give up the whole of the Donbas as Russia wants, they'd be surrendering some very well fortified land that would make it easier for Putin to go back at it. So that requires that they get actually a teeth commitment with troops on the ground and some promise of intervention if he restarts it. Now, the harder you make the security guarantees, the less likely Putin is to accept them. And so this is the kind of doom loop we have been on for the past year. And now Rubio says that the issue set has narrowed and that they are down to just the gnarliest pieces of it. But I have yet to see any substantive reason to think those gnarliest issues have been worked out in a way that the United States can tolerate. And just briefly on your, welcoming Russia back into the normal world of nations, I mean, that for the United States, that should require him to change his intentions, to drop his constant talk about recreating the Soviet empire. It's not commerce alone is not going to change kind of how he sees his place in the world. And I think that's the real, the weakness in that idea.
Well, the U.S. has brought in BlackRock and a couple of financial analysts to see what would it take to kind of rebuild Ukraine as part of this deal. And the number I was told is about $500 billion. Some people have thought it was as high as $1.5 trillion. My source said we think it's probably closer to about 500 billion. Big number, but they would get some of that from Russian reserves that are in Western banks, in Belgium for the most part. But that's got to happen. Ukraine has to be rebuilt. I guess one question is that commercial incentive big enough for Putin to stop? I've thought no. But, the economic pressure is building, Joe.
It is. So, looking at just the Ukrainian attacks on Russian energy is starting to have a real effect. Reuters was reporting this week that Russian state oil and gas revenues are halved in January compared to the previous year. This is the lowest level since July 2020, and that's the money that
2 years before the war.
Yeah, this is the money that it uses to basically finance its war machine. So I think Russia wants this money back. It wants to be able to interact as a normal member of international society and reap the financial benefit from that. But a question is, what is it going to do with that money? And every indication is that it's going to ramp up production of its military and plan for the next time. So that's something that Ukrainians are considering. Another part of seizing these Russian assets and using them to rebuild Ukraine is there's a debate around how much of this goes to unoccupied Ukraine versus occupied Ukraine in a way that would kind of refortify Russia's claim on these territories.
This is Russian-occupied Ukraine.
Yes.
In the east.
Correct.
Yeah, let's listen to Donald Trump talk this week about the outcome of a request he had made to Vladimir Putin to, because of the cold weather, stop attacking in Ukraine. It's a brutal winter there. Stop attacking the energy infrastructure of Ukraine. Let's listen.
It was Sunday to Sunday, and it opened up, and he hit him hard last night. No, he agreed. He kept his word on that. It's a lot. 1 week is, we'll take anything because it's really, really cold over there. But it was on Sunday, and he went from Sunday to Sunday.
You disappointed he didn't go further or go
I
longer?
would like to. I want him to end the war.
Kate, this is becoming on repeat. I want him to end the war, and he doesn't really get Putin to do it. And I guess one of the questions is, you've been writing, how much is Trump willing to ratchet up sanctions? He's been banging on the Europeans to do so, and now we read that the European Union is considering interdicting Russia's shadow oil fleet. We don't know if that'll get through all of the members, as it has to do with the EU. Kind of crazy governance there, but you have to do that. So somebody like Orban in Hungary could object to it. But if that happened, the EU started interdicting these ships, and we started putting some more important sanctions on Russian oil sales. And then in India, the president just did a deal with Modi of India, which he says Modi is going to stop buying Russian oil, which it's been buying at a discounted rate. That could begin to put even more pressure on Russia's financing for the war.
It certainly could. I mean, the Russian economy had basically no growth last year. It is a negligible player in things like artificial intelligence, and it is already on a real wartime footing. I mean, I think Russia's spending about 10% of its economy on defense, higher than that, really, when you count in all other types of things. But for comparison, I mean, the U.S. spends 3%. We're trying to get our friends to 5%. It's an enormous amount of effort that he is putting towards his military infrastructure, and he needs his relationship with China and those oil sales to keep it going. And so I think the economic lever and the military lever are still available here, because I've been arguing for a while now that a deal that just along the current front lines in Ukraine is a pretty fragile one that would make it easy for Putin to go back at it. And ideally, the United States would get him to give up some territory, would get at least a little bit closer back to where he started.
You mean Putin would have to give up some territory?
Yeah, ideally.
We're not giving up Florida, Kate. We're not giving up Florida.
Yeah, I mean, I think for the deal to be stable and durable, in addition to those security guarantees, Putin has to pay some kind of territorial price for what he's done here. And if he gets to hold it all, it becomes very favorable for him to start again. Now, if there was a deal, if we got a deal on the current lines, could we try to swallow it? I mean, maybe, but I'd make that point because I think the economic pressure here is really crucial to at least trying to get a deal that's stronger, that will last longer, that will end the bloodshed for longer, which is what the president really seems to be animated by. And it's also, we can talk more about this in a minute, but we're at an inflection point thinking about what kind of threat Russia is going to present to NATO for the next decade. And this deal really matters to that question.
On that point, there's been some discussion that the Russians, if they got more of the Donbass and was able to capture that fortress line, they might give up some territory further south. There's been some discussion of that. Is that a fair trade in your view?
It's fair trade. That Donbass territory, that fortress belt is so important. That's the Ukrainians' strongest defenses.
And there's a clear run if they break that down to Kyiv, right?
Yep. Well, at least to the Dnieper River. And that's a huge amount of distance that they can just roll through. So Ukrainians are really hesitant to give that up. It's been really interesting hearing Russia's rhetoric about the fortress belt compared to the reality on the ground. And the Kremlin likes to say that it's on the verge. This is going really well. But I was talking this morning to a soldier who's fighting on the Ukrainian side in Pokrovsk. This is kind of one of the epicenters of the fight. And he was describing how this is a slow, grinding battle with enormous amounts of Russian casualties incurred and not a lot of advances. Then further up, this is just outside of the fortress belt, but in Kupiansk, the Ukrainians have actually managed to regain some of that territory. And you're seeing Russian troops diverted from the fortress belt to go fight there. And that's operationally significant. I think the broader point here is that the Russians are having a much more difficult time seizing the fortress belt by force. And so, of course, they're trying to gain it during negotiations.
Yeah. Kate, give us an indication here, more tangible ways and numbers of the casualties that Russia is experiencing. Now, there are terrible casualties on the Ukraine side, too. And Ukraine doesn't have the manpower Russia does. But our friend Seth Jones at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and a colleague put together a pretty comprehensive study based on all of the sourcing that they can get, just what the casualties are here. And they really are staggering. Tell our listeners about that.
Well, I think Seth did a real service here by trying to put some numbers on the record. I mean, he estimated about 1.2 million casualties on the Russian side alone, and that's, killed, wounded, a mix. And he says he estimates about 325,000 killed. And to just give you a sense of the scale here, I mean, we're talking about 5 times the casualties Russians have taken in every conflict they've fought since World War II. I mean, this is just on a completely different scale from Soviet engagements, for instance, in Afghanistan. To give another comparison, the United States did some heavy and tough fighting in the Korean War for 3 years and took maybe 1/6, 1/8 of the casualties we're talking about. So it is important to underscore that we are talking about a war on the magnitude that the world really hasn't seen since World War II. Also, the question too is how much is Putin advancing for these casualties that he's paying? And if you look around the Pokrovsk offensive that Russia has been desperately trying to take all of Pokrovsk, you look around that line of effort, and you see that the Russians haven't been advancing. 70 meters a day on average. That is slower than some of the most brutal offensives of World War I, as Seth really articulated in his paper. It's like if you've been to Manhattan, starting on 42nd Street in the morning, ending up on 43rd Street. And real quick, because you mentioned Ukraine has manpower problems too. But when you start to look at the casualties that in this paper, if Ukraine appears to be, Russia appears to be taking 2-to-1 to 2.5-to-1 the Ukrainian casualties. And that's in part because they're using technology more effectively. They are much more careful about human life. But when you get into 2 to 2.5-to-1 casualties, if you talk to defense analysts, that really does start to get into the range where it becomes hard for Putin to keep sustaining his losses without serious national personnel mobilization that he has been reluctant to do. And so, yes, Ukraine is a smaller power and it has very acute manpower issues. But Russia is not the dominant player in this war the way that they appear to be. They're not winning, even if you look at the manpower element of the war.
Just a little inside baseball here, but months ago, when it looked like the Russians would first be able to capture Pokrovsk, I asked Jillian to write up an editorial about what would, based on the fact that it would fall. It's still in the can because it hasn't fallen.
That's right. They've been trying.
We'll update it when it happens, but that's what we're talking about here in the slow advance, and the way this war is conducted. It's not exactly like the World War I trench war because the lines are further along, and it's patrolled by drones. It's in many ways a drone war. But the Russians, because of the casualties, when they try a big offensive, I gather they're going with motorcycle teams, small groups, patrols. Try to come in and take some territory. How would you like to have that mission? You're cannon fodder.
Yeah, that's right. Pokrovsk, I want to talk about that region. They've been trying to take this for 24 months now, and we keep hearing they're just on the verge of it. Hasn't happened. But you're absolutely right. When I was in the fortress belt in September, I was talking to Ukrainian drone operators, and they're saying you have to think about this war in a different way. Instead of a line that is the front line, this is a 25-mile stretch, and it's known as the kill zone. And what the Russians are basically doing is pointing a gun at their own guys, saying, you advance, your odds aren't good, but there's zero here. And pushing them forward. And so the guy I was talking to this morning was saying, these are undertrained troops that are advancing a couple meters. Maybe we'll take a tree. You'll send 5 out and one of them will survive and be out there waiting for reinforcements. It's a very deadly slog. And you've seen videos in the past couple of weeks of Russian soldiers who haven't gone. And I think the Russians are concerned about this because they're releasing increasingly
dramatic. When you
say
haven't gone, what do you mean?
Refuse to advance.
Refuse to advance. Yeah, these are conscripts who refuse to advance.
Yeah, and there are really horrific videos of Russians tying them up in the forest, hanging them from trees in their underwear, brutalizing them. And I think that's meant to have a psychological effect.
Yeah, this will happen to you if you don't go over into the kill zone. The question, for months as this war went on, Kate, the assumption was, Russians don't care about casualties. This is their history. Putin can take it. He controls the media entirely. So there's the word about some of this doesn't really spread. They were also paying the families of KIAs substantial sums compared to what their regular incomes are. Now that doesn't make up for a son lost. But this was all designed to kind of make it easier to take these large casualties. But sooner or later, this is cast a wear on the support domestically for what Russia is doing. Now, we can't hear opposition because you can't have any reporter in. We had our to listen and report fairly. We had ours arrested for months before he was released. So but it's hard to know just how much pressure Putin is really under domestically.
It's near impossible to know, really. I mean, he has no regard for human life. Of course, he's proved that in his conduct of the 4 years of this war. But he does have to, consider his, grip on power. I think that is all, ultimately what influences his analysis. And a lot of these conscripts have come from, far-flung rural villages in very poor parts of Russia. And I think eventually he does have a replacement problem because he is just burning troops basically as fast as he can conscript them. And that eventually, I think, is a problem. And my argument has been, okay, we need to use the economic and military levers we have to put more pressure on Putin, not because he's going to recognize that he's committing an awful humanitarian slaughter, but because this needs to not be able to be achieved at a reasonable cost to him anymore.
Right.
Jillian's point about Pokrovsk really does bear on the larger negotiations picture too, because the argument for several months has been Ukraine should just give up the Donbass because Putin's going to take it anyway. He's going to, and there's been a debate among, analysts and intelligence communities about how long it's going to take Putin to take the Donbass. But I think the rate of advance and the Russian underperformance in Pokrovsk, it favors those who have said, no, Ukraine should be careful about giving up the Donbass because Putin can't just walk through it. He would have done so by now. And so the slow rate of advance, I'm hoping that this CSIS report is read by our negotiators and our administration officials, because it actually does give you a new way of thinking about the war, that actually Putin has some precarious domestic economic realities and military battlefield realities that he can't sleep on. And the United States can use those to get a better, more durable peace in Ukraine.
One of the people I hope reads it is the Vice President of the United States, J.D. Vance, who's been making the argument that Putin's going to win inevitably anyway. So Ukraine, suck it up and cut the deal you can now. And they don't want to take that offer from the VP. But the levers that the U.S. in Europe could use, Jillian. Europe, it's one of the scandals of this war is that the Europeans are still buying Russian oil and natural gas. But so they ought to cut that off. But they have reduced the amount they take in. But these new sanctions on the shadow fleet interdiction would be very interesting. The other thing is, the bill in the Senate with something like 80-some co-sponsors, the U.S. Senate, Lindsey Graham and Senator Blumenthal from Connecticut, that would put sanctions, so-called secondary sanctions, on the users of buyers of Russian oil. And the president gave his go-ahead to put that on the floor, pass it in the Senate. It would pass easily. And there's still no vote. John Thune hasn't put it up for a vote. But do you think that would make a big difference in Ukraine?
I think it would make a difference. No one thing is going to win this war, but I think there are a couple places that you can hit Putin to make it count. And one of them is in the purse. And another one is on energy facilities, because that has an effect on the purse. And you're seeing Ukraine ramp up these long-range strikes and it actually having an effect. And the third component is on the battlefield. With these secondary sanctions, I think going after the shadow fleet is a really good idea, not just for Ukraine's sake, but for the sake of European security. There have been concerns that Russia's using the shadow fleet to launch drones to spy on Europe far away from Ukraine.
Well, we've seen evidence of that.
Yeah. But I guess just on the military point, Ukraine is ramping up this long-range strike campaign, and the general staff just announced that Flamingo missiles, these are the Ukrainian long-range missiles that were just developed, were used to strike a Russian ICBM hub.
How far into Russia?
Pretty far. I mean, this was in one of the oblasts that's near the Caspian Sea. So it's not the maximum range of the Tomahawk claimed, but it's still a pretty far strike. Ukraine is doing this with its domestically produced weapons, probably with Western intelligence. But we could be giving them things like the Tomahawks that would be ramping up that pressure and making it more difficult for Russia to sustain its fight and more costly for Putin to do that. And that is something that we should be doing. I was talking to the developer of Flamingo this morning. She was saying, there have been some strikes that have not been reported, details forthcoming, and you're going to expect a lot more of these.
Fascinating. Kate, what do you hear about whether or not this bill on secondary sanctions is ever going to get a vote on the Senate floor?
Yeah, it's in limbo. I mean, I think I'm hopeful that it will get a vote on the floor because it just has such overwhelming bipartisan support, and because the president has said, greenlit it in various capacities, various shades of green, if you will, that seem to change by the day. But so I do think it will eventually receive a vote. I wish it would receive a vote sooner. But I think Jillian's right too, that sanctions alone are essential and part of it has a larger strategy. But the president really backed off giving Tomahawk weapons to Ukraine, decided they didn't need them. And while Ukraine deserves tremendous credit for their seriousness in developing their own long-range strike options like the Flamingo, it's very hard to compete with the Tomahawk for precision and range, and also just as a really powerful signal that the United States is serious about bringing the war to an end in a way that is durable. And so I just think that blend has to be there. And I'm concerned about a delayed sanctions vote, but I'm concerned that it's really, as the president is focused on the Middle East and elsewhere in Venezuela, that he's not giving the attention to the potential weapon support to Ukraine that he's going to need to do to get a deal.
Think back 4 years and think of the extraordinary effort that Ukraine has made. I mean, when Putin got into this war, he thought he was going to take Kyiv in 3 days. He sent in the troops into the Air Force. They'd capture Zelensky at his command post. They'd send in the tanks around the city. Boom, it'd be over. 4 years later, a very different reality. I think you can't underestimate understate the degree to which the Ukrainians have demonstrated enormous courage and ability to sacrifice for what they think is their war of independence. And it's an astonishing story, really, when you think about it. And I think that for Putin's point of view, this is not a man who shows publicly that he is given to self-reflection. But when he does look at the ceiling at night or at the moon, he has to think, I didn't expect this. I didn't expect 4 years. And I didn't expect this amount of devastation. Now, whether or not he's willing to stop it because he's invested so much, he may think that I can't stop now because if I do, I will fall and therefore I will be imprisoned or worse. But it's one of the great miscalculations in modern times.
Yeah, it's really extraordinary. I think he's looking up at that ceiling, thinking at night, saying, this is the bed I want to die in. But I do think that there's something to be said here about what Ukrainians are demonstrating. I was looking at that polling, and they are going through such a tough patch right now in Kiev. The heat's been off. It's as cold there as it is in New York. I have friends who are going around with, their flashlights and their power banks, just trying to make it through the day in their down comforters. And yet I'm looking at this poll, and it's saying that 65% of Ukrainians are willing to endure this war for as long as is necessary. And that is up from before Russia began these strikes on the energy sector. So I think Ukrainians view this as a fight that they cannot lose. Their lives, their families, their freedoms are at stake. And that determination and that courage is really fueled by necessity.
And they know the stories of what happened to families, Ukrainian families in the occupied territories. Their children were snatched up and brought to Russia, for example. Many were summarily shot. Kate, you're going to get the last word.
Yeah, Ukraine's performance, if you think back to the beginning of the war, even in the United States, they were talking that Ukraine couldn't hold on very long, that soon we'd be arming a counterinsurgency against the Russians. That was a live discussion only 2 weeks into the war. And so for them to have held on 4 years, like I said, it goes to my point about kind of flipping our thinking here from, oh, Ukraine's an eventual loser, to actually Ukraine has overperformed. And we have an opportunity to turn that into at least something approaching a defeat for Putin. And there's still a real U.S. interest in doing that.
All right. Thank you, Kate Odell. Thank you, Jillian Melcher. Thank you all for listening. We are here every day on Potomac Watch.